One of the strangest facts about international relations is that the effectiveness of a strategy often does not correlate with the frequency of its use. Case in point, foreign-imposed regime change, a complicated phrase that refers to the thing that the United States is currently trying in Venezuela. Just focusing on the United States and going back in time, you have Libya, which, at least there, the United States was only providing an assist while rebels on the ground did the heavy lifting. The Iraq War under the younger Bush. The war in Afghanistan, also under the younger Bush. Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti under Clinton. The invasion of Panama under the elder Bush. And the invasion of Grenada under Reagan. We could go further back to cases from the Cold War and discuss, for example, how weapons aid to Afghan rebels eventually backfired. We could expand our scope and include cases of strictly CIA support and go swimming in the Bay of Pigs. We could look at non-US countries as the initiator, lest we forget that the most important war of the millennium, so far, began because Moscow wanted to overthrow the government in Kyiv. Or we could call my academic alter ego and get more serious about how all this gets defined. But no matter what, we would wind up at the same conclusion. You rarely get a good outcome when you try the strategy. In fact, out of all of those that I rattled off, only Panama and Grenada are remembered positively. But even then, they were not major foreign policy wins. Compare that to something like Iraq, which completely sunk the historical legacy of the Bush administration. Heck, Bush starting the war in Afghanistan ultimately left a giant black mark on the Biden administration 2 decades later. For those of you who frequent Las Vegas, that risk-return trade-off is probably one that you want to avoid. And yet it keeps happening. In fact, we are in the middle of a new one right now. Heck, I do not even think anyone would be surprised if the United States double-dipped in Venezuela in the next few weeks. So why does it keep happening? Shouldn't we only be observing the cases where states are good at implementing the policy? It is not like the people deciding to try their luck are oblivious to the previous cases, as much as analysts often like to pretend that they know everything, and the people who actually do this for a living have never opened up a history book. So, again, why? Well, I applaud you for asking, because it allows me to talk about what I actually want to talk about, and what I always want to talk about. That's right, we're doing lines on maps. For those of you short on time, here is the basic idea. Both sides of a conflict can anticipate the likely outcome of an attempt at foreign-imposed regime change, and everyone agrees that it would be a mess. They therefore usually bargain their problems away with a deal commensurate with the expected outcome. Thus, the main consequence of being okay versus outright bad at foreign-imposed regime change is how much you can extract out of the settlement from the target. Skill does not determine whether you actually attempt it in practice, with an important exception that I will cover later. Instead, what determines whether we observe foreign-imposed regime change is the presence of bargaining frictions. Things like overestimating one's chances at success, or the inability to establish credible long-run deals. Those bargaining frictions are at best weakly correlated with capacity, leading to the fundamental inference problem. If you want the more detailed story, I can give it to you in 2 steps. Step 1 is to establish the bargaining logic. Suppose we had a hypothetical leader named Sad Euro. Any similarities to real people are purely coincidental. Sad Euro faces a rival country that is interested in some valuable set of stakes that we will represent with this bar of goodies. It could be a pile of money, it could be oil wealth, or heck, it could even be the welfare of Sad Euro's own citizens, which Sad Euro likes to exploit for his own personal gain. The problem is that Sad Euro and the rival country cannot enjoy the prize simultaneously. The more that one enjoys, the less that the other enjoys. If the rival country invades, it can try to topple the leader and take over the good for itself. We might draw a line that divides the expected outcome of the conflict accordingly. Here it indicates that the rival expects to win about half the time. Here the rival country is much stronger. Here it is weaker. What I am going to convince you by the end of the video, if I am any good at my job, is that measuring the capability of the rival country is not going to give you a good idea of whether it will ultimately execute the strategy. You see, no matter the rival's precise capacity, opting for foreign-imposed regime change is expensive. Some portion of the prize will evaporate because all of the death and destruction that will take place in the meantime. We can use the space between this left line and the expected outcome line to represent those costs. If you can take over the country without destroying all of its infrastructure, then those costs might be relatively small. If you do not expect a clean operation, then those costs might be large instead. Meanwhile, Sad Euro does not like seeing stuff get blown up either, so he has his own costs that we will represent going the other way. As I have drawn things here, the key takeaways are that 1. The parties should stop short of fighting because of those costs, but that 2. Sad Euro has to make concessions to the rival country to avoid war. That is because if Sad Euro tries to stand firm at giving no concessions at all, the rival will realize that even net the costs of war, fighting still pays something, and something is better than nothing. Indeed, the costs of war ensure that a range of settlements would be mutually preferable to fighting. If this sounds familiar, that is because it is. We have generalized the territorial representation I usually talk about in Ukraine to being about anything at all. We should all count our blessings that the costs of war create incentives for parties to find ways to avoid heading down that path. However, there is a super captivating implication here. If our baseline expectation is that the parties ought to settle short of a conflict because fighting is costly, think about what being good or bad does to that expectation. A state that is good at foreign-imposed regime change might be looking at the situation like this, with both the expected outcome and the costs having shifted to the right. But this does not mean that the rival country starts engaging in the enterprise more often. Rather, Sad Euro simply internalizes the extent of the threat and starts making further concessions to avoid a conflict. A state that is bad at regime change would instead have everything shifted to the left. However, that does not mean that the rival country avoids the enterprise more often either. Rather, Sad Euro simply realizes that the threat is lacking, and therefore makes fewer concessions. Only when the state is atrocious at regime change can Sad Euro finally stand up to the opponent and offer no concessions at all. It turns out that states have atrocious capacity in the vast majority of bilateral relationships. Foreign-imposed regime change is generally hard, and requires a substantial outlay of military supplies. Thus, the cases where we actually see it influence global politics tend to only be with neighboring countries, or cases involving the most powerful of rival states. The quantity of cases just thin out as you increase along the capacity dimension. This also puts us behind the 8 ball for later. Because so few cases are over in the extremely powerful camp in practice, it would be hard to observe them even if those capable countries always ignored the bargaining logic and just blindly fought everywhere. Nonetheless, it might be tempting to think that the moderate cases tend to get filtered out because those countries still are not very good at the activity. Thus, even though they outnumber the strong cases in practice, we ought to see a bias toward the more powerful region. But you should already see the problem with using data on observed foreign-imposed regime change to draw an inference here. Attempts at foreign-imposed regime change at any level should not happen. Rather, the parties involved should internalize the threat of it occurring, and then negotiate around that possibility. We do not only observe cases where the rival state is good at foreign-imposed regime change, because when the rival is good at it, the sad Euros of the world concede more to convince the rival to not bother. And, on the face of it, rivals that are bad at it may still be interested in trying if the sad Euros of the world do not buckle at all. However, we are still left to explain why we ever observe actual cases of foreign-imposed regime change. Well, the answer is the pair of words that you have heard from me way too much over the last 4 years. Bargaining frictions. Let's focus on the one that you know best. Overestimation of one's ability to accomplish the task. This is familiar because we have discussed it at length regarding all of the intelligence estimates that Putin had leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. Thanks to some poor domestic institutional structures, everything that he saw suggested that the plan would work smoothly. Now, as we just discussed, that alone does not explain why the war occurred. If everyone agreed that Russia had the upper hand here, that would have filtered through the negotiations. Ukraine would have been more conciliatory to avoid Russia launching the invasion. However, we have also discussed at length how Ukraine had private information that it could sustain itself through the war, at least as compared to what Russia was demanding, and that private information proved to be correct. Note that this is different from the keyboard warrior suggestion that policymakers pretend like foreign-imposed regime change will be super easy, barely an inconvenience. Even conditional on that belief, you will still get variation in estimates of whether it will be incredibly difficult versus just kind of difficult. And it is hard for policymakers to know exactly which of the cases they are in. Furthermore, it is hard for us to criticize policymakers that they always overestimate their capacity, because the cases where they do overestimate their capacity are more salient. After all, those are the ones that result in conflicts. When a state underestimates its capacity, it simply accepts the bargain proposal put in front of it, even though it perversely may have been able to do better by imposing regime change. We do not talk much about those cases, though, because there is no war to observe. And then there is the fact that private information about capacity is not the only reason you see attempts at regime change. Shifting power, first strike advantages, we could spend all day talking about other bargaining problems if we wanted to. The larger point here, though, is that the presence of bargaining problems is uncorrelated, or maybe weakly correlated with the capacity to engage in foreign-imposed regime change. Thus, we end up with the following observational relationship. All of the potential, not attempted, but potential capacity to impose regime change might look like this. As before, they are concentrated on the low end, because imposing regime change is generally difficult. States that are incredibly bad at doing it never engage in it, because even if they overestimate their strength, they are still so weak that the costs of trying are larger than their inflated expectations of the benefits. Everywhere else, bargaining problems sometimes result in a chance of bargaining failure, and thus an attempt at regime change. But remember that the strategy is generally difficult, and because bargaining failure is mostly uncorrelated with capacity, we still end up with the bulk of the cases down here. Again, despite those countries being bad at the policy, they nevertheless try, because the offers they receive from their opponents are even smaller. Another way to visualize the problem is that the sad Euros of the world are always trying to guess where they think their opponents' break-even points are, which is the expected outcome of the conflict minus the costs. That is the level of concessions they want to offer, because it allows them to keep the most in return. Whether we get war or not depends on whether they slightly overshoot or slightly undershoot that mark. Moving the baseline level of capacity around simply changes where the sad Euros are centering this guessing game. But the presence of the guessing game is hardly correlated with that baseline. Thus, knowing the baseline level of capacity does not tell us much about whether a realized attempt at regime change will happen. And that returns us to the broader point from the top, which extends past foreign-imposed regime change. International relations is a strategic environment, and that really screws with our ability to draw inferences. It is possible to accurately identify an incentive, say that foreign-imposed regime change is difficult, but then we cannot immediately use that information to make sense of what we observe in practice. Those who pull the strings are also aware of that incentive, and so they counter-strategize accordingly. In this case, it is the opponent resisting an equal amount due to the difficulty of that particular conflict. All of it ends up washing out, creating headaches for those of us who want to study it. Well, if that describes you, and you are a glutton for punishment, my textbook on crisis bargaining theory makes this a recurring theme. But bear in mind that it expects you to already know game theory going into it. For now, you can check out this playlist if you want to know more about the crisis in Venezuela. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.